welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on Channel 9, on WJOP LP Newburyport FM 96.3, and also on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm delighted and honored to welcome today's guest. Professor Robert J. Allison is here. He's chair of the History, Language, and Global Culture Department at Suffolk University and president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. He's the chair of Revolution 250, a consortium of organizations planning commemorations of the revolution's 250th anniversary in 2026. And he's the author of numerous books on topics including the history of Boston and the American Revolution. He's also the co-editor of The Essential Debate on the Constitution. So he's the perfect person to have with us today to talk about what I guess I'd be calling precedents and hopefully possibilities in history. And so first of all, Professor Allison, welcome and thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show.
Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, absolutely. The pleasure is mine. Well, I'm curious to start out, Professor Allison, have there been times since the 1860s in the United States when we felt, some of us anyway, as though we might be on the cusp of another civil war, where you have people in states seriously contemplating the idea of secession? What were the divisive issues, if we have been, and how did we manage to pull back from the brink?
That's a good question. And I guess the hopeful answer is yes, there have been. We've often been a fractious people, divided about a lot of things. And I think the one thing that holds us together is recognizing what we have in common, what we share. And sometimes this transcends kind of political rat-a-tat-tat. It's really a core idea about being American, the fact that we can disagree, the fact that we can argue with each other. But just thinking in terms of specifics as opposed to general platitudes, the year 1876 was the most violent in American history after the Civil War, and it was a time of tremendous labor strife. That is, the economy had tanked. There was a major recession, major depression going on, and there was a general strike that really begins on railroads. And it's, you have railroad strikers burning places like Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, actually the transit hubs, and the states responding with militia troops putting down this insurrection. And you have from the 1870s into the 1890s, you have tremendous violence going on in cities, and with fights between strikers. Groups like the Industrial Workers of the World form an anarchist group that sees the state's goal is to oppress us, so our goal should be to smash the state essentially and create one big union. So you have this kind of threat, as well as socialism, communism, which are emerging ideas at this time. And it's a perilous time, really a disastrous time, the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and a political system that seems unable to address this, aside from the fact that we'll use force against those who are trying to overthrow the state. I should just point out that in 1901, of course, anarchists kill the president. In 1880s, the anarchists blow up the Tsar of Russia. It's a global movement. Yeah. And then the big question is, well, what prevents that from happening? By the way, you can also see all kinds of interesting ideas, some of them crackpot ideas emerging at this time about what to do to solve these problems. A guy named Henry George writes a book called Progress and Poverty. And it's an interesting, complicated economic idea that Henry George has as a way to solve all of these problems. Another series of books that emerges at this time is by a journalist in the Midwest named L. Frank Baum, and it's about the wonderful land of Oz, and the fight is between gold and silver, or east and west. As you see, and in the Oz books, you see the country being pulled apart. You have the good witches of the north and south, that is this old idea, and then the east and west are the ones that are really at odds. You have all kinds of parallels between the Wizard of Oz and the political climate of the 1890s. the yellow brick road, yellow bricks of gold, and the various characters, the Tin Woodsman, that is the industrial worker, the scarecrow, the farmer, the cowardly lion. And it's in the illustrations, he looks very much like William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic presidential candidate in the 1890s and first decade of the 20th century, you know, and Dorothy Gale, girl from Kansas, who's plunked down in the middle of this world. And of course, the man behind the curtain, the wonderful Wizard of Oz, turns out to be just a guy standing behind a curtain. But again, you have the emergence of this new economic system, very mysterious. We don't quite know how it works, but if you're a farmer or industrial worker, you know, it's not working out too well for you. So why is this? And a big question. Henry George, as I said, is trying to get at an answer to the question. I think in the long term, what prevents this from turning into a cataclysm, which also prevents, by the way, the United States from becoming a socialist country, a communist country, which seemed to be what was happening in industry. And of course, it's what Marx predicted would happen. The thing is, the economic system actually is able to benefit those who are seeming to be exploited by it. It's not as though a working class is perpetually a working class, but they're able to buy into a middle class. And that's the idea of mobility is what stops the whole system from crashing down. Yes, there are people like Jay Gould or John D. Rockefeller who are amassing fortunes, but also the accumulation of wealth is spring spread. It's transcending simply a narrow social class. So that's one, I suppose, optimistic way of looking at this. It's something that Theodore Roosevelt gets at in his speech. You know, Roosevelt was a great reformer. He was also from the aristocracy, not really an aristocrat in the same scale as a J.P. Morgan, but, and think about it, Morgan hadn't started off from a position of economic power. He gets there, and that's that idea. Roosevelt, though, gave a speech in about 1907 about the man with the muckrake. He's talking about the journalists, and he had worked with a lot of these guys. And it's a passage really from Pilgrim's Progress. It's the man with the muckrake who's raking the muck, and all he sees is this ooze, and he doesn't look up to see the celestial city, which is the goal of the Christian in Pilgrim's Progress. Of course, a book that everyone in the 19th century would have read and would have known this story. But here you have the man with the muckrake. All he sees, all that Lincoln Steffens or Ida Tarbell sees, is the detritus being created by this industrializing society, and not seeing that ultimately it is going to be a benefit to everyone working in it. You know, in 1920, I had talked at the beginning of this long rambling monologue about
it's not rambling, it's fascinating.
about the kind of industrial change happening and the strikes and so on. The big thing that's being demanded by the various industrial workers is first a 10-hour workday or then an 8-hour workday. And these are things that the industry is resisting vociferously. And by 1912, 1913, 1915, 1920, these industries are guaranteeing an 8-hour workday because they need to keep workers. And, you know, the Ford Motor Company institutes a minimum wage for their workers, as well as a cafeteria and paid vacations, because they can afford to, and also know they need to keep their employees. And it's also a way to avert their employees from forming unions. We will give you more than a union could. So one of the things that really changes is that industries adopt what had been the wild claims of the labor reformers as a way of keeping a workforce and having a certain loyalty. So that's, I suppose, the change that happens over the course of this long conflict. I think if we were sitting in 1890, we would have seen the end is going to be a cataclysm. By 1900, it looks a lot different. And by 1920, it certainly looks a lot different. That ushers in a decade of prosperity. Ends badly with the stock market crash and the Great Depression. But still, that is, it's one of the things I find salutary about studying history is we can always find dark days. And I'm not saying people always overcome them, or some that there's always a way out, but there has been. That's our survival as a species.
Well, there's a pendulum swing as you're describing it. And also there are themes that come through as you talk. And that was fascinating. Thank you so much. I will never see The Wizard of Oz in the same way again. And I'm going to have to watch it again soon with those parallels in mind. But there's the divisiveness that often stem from an acute kind of frustration that people have, and an inequality that people easily can perceive. And then the strands that I pull out of what you said, although I'm sure I'm oversimplifying them, but people need hope, and people need to see that some of their need for a sense of equity are being met. And also the other theme you talked about earlier on, and it seems very relevant given what's happening in the United States today, given that people are uniting in support of Ukraine. And it seems to be creating a bipartisan swell of support, which we don't see much of these days. And we'll talk about partisanship in a minute, is that people need to start seeing shared values. They need to start seeing themselves as Americans with an equal kind of stake in what our country can represent. So there is hope in what you said.
Yes.
And so I thank you for that. And that was just fascinating. But it also makes me want to ask you about the next example of hopefully precedents and possibilities. That has to do with whether there are precedents for a party, a president of either party, it could be, whose followers appear to have formed what's often been described as a cult-like following of loyalists. And by that, I mean a loyal cult-like following being that whatever the leader, the popular charismatic leader says or does, people will follow the leader. As you know, the former president famously said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and people would still vote for him. And so I'm curious to find out, is there a precedent for a president of either party being able to form this kind of cult-like following of loyalists? And what was it that made them magnetic to people? And what finally broke the fever is the phrase that people are using today.
It's a very interesting question. Of course, I remember in 2008, the posters of hope with Barack Obama. And that idea that, and the crowds turning out to see Obama, who was seen by some as the Messiah or the one. And I don't think it's necessarily something he played up. He saw it, I think, as a way to get elected, which he did. But, think about it, in his first year in office, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize based on expectation of ushering in a different world. And I suspect what happened in that case was simply reality, the reality of governing and the reality of having to disappoint your supporters, I suppose. I think one thing that's happened, and again, it's not a partisan thing, but I think each party sees it as advantageous, is turning the presidency into a kingship, which really wasn't intended to be, but there's really not a way to avoid it. A figure like Washington was a centralizing figure, and Washington was very conscious that he was playing a role. But on the other hand, Washington did have his detractors. You wouldn't get far. You wouldn't get much political mileage out of running down George Washington, but still, he is attacked by people who didn't like various policies. So, but I think it's a 20th century phenomenon, the idea of the presidency being the central office. And Theodore Roosevelt, when I was mentioning in really a salutary way a few minutes ago, really plays this. The presidency, a bully pulpit, and Roosevelt becomes a central character. Someone said he was the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. And subsequently, it's hard for someone like Calvin Coolidge or Gerald Ford to have that same charisma. I think but one of the things you need is a certain charisma, which Roosevelt certainly had, and his cousin Franklin certainly had. which gives the supporters certainly, people want to believe in something, I think, and want to believe in something bigger than them. And another thing we've seen in the 20th century is a decline in church attendance, religious faith, the idea of this being where we, get rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. We're looking for our gods closer to home. And I think we're all inevitably going to be disappointed. So what breaks, I think, just to get back to your analogy, is often simply reality. And that you can't put superhuman or godlike qualities on someone who is human.
Only in the Marvel universe.
That's the Marvel universe, exactly.
Will that work? But reality, in other words, eventually catches up with us all. And I think as you're talking about what we have today is also a celebrity culture.
Exactly, we do. Yes, yeah. We know much more about what's happening with the Kardashians than what's happening with our own families. So.
That's right. It also makes me think famously about the John Kennedy, Richard Nixon debates. And how people came across on TV, and they came across very differently. And of course, Kennedy had all the charisma, and Nixon had none. He did go on to be elected president, but that didn't end well.
Poor Nixon. If you listen to the debates on the radio, Nixon is very well informed, and Nixon is very articulate. But Kennedy did come across. Nixon actually did know how to use television. The Checkers speech was really one of the great examples of someone using the medium of television for a very particular thing. And Nixon, the Nixon-Kennedy debates are kind of an anomaly in his long career of, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, they know how to use the media. And that's become the thing too with, and of course, knowing how to use television. I had one old timer in Boston tell me once that if James Michael Curley had been around in the era of television, he would have been president, which is likely. Someone like Curley understands how to use this in a way that I guess I struggle with. But anyway, that's.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting to think about how the criteria and the talent set you need to have in order to accrue and retain political power has shifted over time.
It really has. And we have actually the opposite way of choosing presidents, from looking for the skills they need. You want someone who's good on television, which isn't necessarily, you need some of that. But I always, by the way, tell my students never to vote for a college professor, because superficially we have, we're good at talking and we can be very engaging. But we have the wrong skill set for being politicians. I am always sure that I am not only the smartest person in the room, but the only one in the room anyone should listen to. By the way, this is what makes faculty meetings so horrendous. And I also know I like it when you write down everything I've said. And if at the end of the semester you agree with everything I've said, then I know you're really smart. And if for some reason what you say disagrees with what I've said, what I'll do is repeat what I just said, but use smaller words and speak more slowly.
And Professor Allison, you'll be tested on it.
Yes, exactly.
So if you didn't listen, you won't pass. Well, speaking of how people are elected, that brings us to the next topic I wanted to ask you about. The United States, we're a democratic republic, and the consent of the governed is where our government is supposed to accrue and acquire its power, determines who will rule. And that's why elections, trusted elections, are so critical to the functioning of our democracy and what people lately refer to as the idea of America. And most of us equate democracy then with majority rule. With safeguards built in by the Constitution, the balance of powers preventing the tyranny of the majority, but with the Electoral College and with the fact that each state, regardless of how tiny their population is, and some states have such a small population, they have more senators than they have people in Congress. So regardless of the state size, they have the same representation in the Senate. A situation arises in which it appears that our Constitution has allowed for the tyranny of the minority. So I'm curious to find out, did the framers of the Constitution foresee that this might someday become a problem? or given that, of course, they granted the right to vote in the beginning only to white property owners, would they never have imagined that this, even if it developed, would be problematic? So I'm just curious to find out whether they ever foresaw this or whether this would have beyond what they imagined.
Well, I think that's an interesting question. And I think the important thing to remember is they were solving a set of problems that they saw. And they did a very good job, I think, and creating a system that has endured. And recognizing, not necessarily let's solve these immediate problems, but let's create a system. Just think about it. We know that we've seen revolutions since our own. And in retrospect, the easy thing is toppling the bad old regime. The much more difficult thing is creating something that won't be worse. And in this case, they succeeded in creating something that wasn't worse. Now, the various things you mentioned, the Electoral College, which I believe is a tremendous thing, and I wouldn't want to have a simple majority choosing the president, and the Senate having representation of the states, both were meant to prevent majority tyranny, something you mentioned. Yeah. That is simply, why should 51% be able to tyrannize over 49%, or for that matter, 60% over 40%? That is recognizing that there are shifting minorities, something James Madison certainly understood. And so both of these systems, the Senate and the Electoral College, are designed to check the majority, not to give the minority power. I mean, this is, for Madison, the great conundrum of representative government is, how do you have a system ruled by the majority in which the majority can't tyrannize over a minority? That is really the problem. And both of these things are meant to prevent that. Without the Electoral College, you could essentially have every election would be focused on New York and California and the big media centers. You wouldn't see anyone worrying about West Virginia or Iowa or any of these other places. So that, I think, is a salutary thing. Having an election that has to be national as opposed to simply regional. Let's gin out our vote in these places and try to suppress it in other places. You need to attend to a big country. And it was a big country even in 1789. So having this particular system, doesn't allow for minority tyranny, I think was the word you used, because the majority is still going to be there. Madison recognized, though, there are different kinds of factions. That is, people of different religious faiths, people of different economic interests. I mean, they may intersect. And the danger comes when you have a majority faction formed over one particular issue or one particular thing that then can overwhelm the minority. So the only way to prevent that is to extend the sphere of the republic and divide power in a way. It's also, by the way, why the states maintain a certain importance, because the states, it was thought the states are closer, we have more state reps than there are members of Congress. You probably know both your member of Congress and your state rep and your state senator. Many people don't, but these people are answerable to you and how you choose them. So they have to attend to your opinion. They're not always going to agree with you, but they do have to acknowledge your opinion. So it's a complicated story, a complicated piece, but it's a system created not to allow transient majorities to tyrannize over minorities, but to require that there's a certain degree of consensus. That is, you have to have a certain recognition that, okay, Mary Jacobsen's in now, she can do whatever she wants, but then I may be in next year and can just overturn all of that. It's not meant to do that. It's meant to create a kind of stability and a kind of adherence to listening to various interests and not simply being dictated to by various interests.
Yeah. It's clear, and you've given a very clear description of what the intention was and why it was framed that way. And that seems like a really important protection. But one of the things that happened over the course of history is that our whole population is no longer agrarian by any means, but it's increasingly urban. And so now you have the phenomenon, and people talk about this a lot, in every presidential election, that, instead of paying attention only to New York and California, people only pay attention to the swing states. Mm-hmm. And also the discrepancy between the extent of the population that is now centralized in these urban areas is so vastly greater than the tiny percentages of population that are now in a state like Idaho or Wyoming. And so I wonder if that dynamic shifts the way the Electoral College winds up functioning and takes it away from being, as you eloquently described, a protection of the interests of the minority into something else. So I'd just be interested.
It's an interesting question. I really think the problem isn't the Electoral College so much as how come every 4 years we let Iowa and New Hampshire determine who the candidates are going to be?
And they're both very small states.
They're small states. Iowa is bigger, but it's one reason, by the way, for the ethanol subsidy, because yes, no one's going to take that on. John McCain tried, and it didn't do him very much good.
Good luck.
So that's something. Looking at how do we change the way the candidates are chosen, I think, would be much more important than trying to jigger with something, the Electoral College. And again, the whole primary system, the whole party system is something that has emerged really in the 20th century. I think 1952 was the first New Hampshire primary. And how did that become such an important thing? And partly it is because it's an easy thing to write about. You can write about these elections as kind of a horse race. And here you see who's ahead after New Hampshire. And so essentially you have a group of, 20-year-old journalists, 20-something journalists sitting in a bar in Manchester, determining who actually won, determined it based on where they placed in New Hampshire. I'm sorry, now I'm bashing New Hampshire. But it's something to wonder about. And that's something I think the parties could change, but I think New Hampshire has a state law that if anyone ever tries to have an election earlier than ours, we'll move it. So who knows, maybe New Hampshire will be having its primary the day after the next election.
Well, you brought up political parties, and that was the next thing I wanted to ask you about, because I know that having a political party doesn't have to equate with extreme partisanship. But today's political parties appear to engender a kind of almost rabid loyalty, kind of like, Patriots fans or Yankees fans, or even more intense. There seem to be a substantive number of people in political parties today who don't just see people in the other political party as political opponents or people who disagree with you, but they're the enemy. And I mean, I'm registered with a political party as a convenience. I will always see myself first and foremost as an American. It's a convenience for me. And if the person running an election that, agrees with my values and they're in my party, of course, I'll vote for them. But if the person running in my party, is not in accord or in alignment with my values or has a character I can't tolerate, I'll vote for somebody quite happily of the other party. So I'm curious to find out, I know that the framers discussed political parties and whether that was a wise way to solve the problems after the revolution, as you described before. But I'm curious to find out exactly what were they worried about a political party system would unleash? And why did they decide that it was worth the risk? Because I think we're seeing the risk today.
Yeah. It's interesting because virtually all of them said they hated the idea of parties, but then they went about forming them, okay? And they saw them as organizing factions and perpetuating a faction. That is, and so the interest becomes one of the party as opposed to the nation, really, as you said. And incidentally, as George Washington said in his farewell message, he warns about the influence of party and someone using a political party to advance his own interest on the ruins of public liberty. And also it opens the way to foreign intrigue. France and England both interested in who would be part of, who would be running things, would be supporting a party. And you saw that in the 1790s with both the French and the English interested in different of the American political parties. since the 1880s, every year on Washington's birthday, the Senate meets and one member of the Senate reads Washington's farewell message, this eloquent warning about parties and excessive partisanship. And then the Senate goes back to doing what they've always done. But it's a good question. And on one hand, parties do, I think we're in a particular moment now where the parties do seem kind of stuck, and each one is appealing to its own base or wanting to turn out its own base. In some cases, kind of afraid of its own base. I think members of both parties really worried about the crazies on the extreme who are looking at a chance to, you win a primary and then you're the nominee. And that's, it's not a good time for parties. On the other hand, I have to say, I do spend time with people who are in politics, and they do talk about the things that are being done. That is, they're able to work against this in many ways. Which I think is essential. By the way, in the period we started off talking about, the 1880s, 1890s, the parties were also very well organized, and there weren't really clear ideological differences between the two parties. And the elections were also very close, a period of very close elections. So I think the thing to think about too, it's not, you and I are both above all of this, but I know people who say, I hate partisanship, and if only the other side would stop being so partisan.
Yes, exactly.
I think the party's real interest is getting elected, and they're going to appeal to whatever they can to get elected. And that, I think, is something that you and I, who are more independent thinkers, at least we like to think so, could use to our advantage, or to the advantage of society as a whole. I think, on the one hand, I don't think anyone in politics is setting out to make things worse, but it's all they know. How to use this particular skill set to, but I think the onus really falls on us. When Benjamin Franklin was asked, what kind of a government is it? Is it a monarchy or a republic? He said, it's a republic if you can keep it.
Yes.
It's up to you as a voter, as a citizen, or as an elected official, and not think that there's someone else who is going to do this. Somehow in Newburyport, you found a race of demigods who can run things. It's not really the way the system is intended to work.
Yeah. So the responsibility falls back to the citizens ourselves to rein in the excesses. So, I'm really, really curious to ask you about what's happening in the country these days around the teaching of history. There are certain politicians and parents who appear to want to censor history, to delete aspects of the history, in particular of slavery and of racial oppression and violence, justifying this editing of history in some cases as needed to protect the feelings of white children, prevent them from feeling guilty. And as an historian, I'm really curious to find out, what are your responses to these arguments? And if you do, why do you think it's important to teach young people, in an age-appropriate way, of course, the truth about these harsher aspects of American history?
Well, first, I'm a little skeptical of the claim that there is this widespread attempt to censor that particular teaching of history. I do see a much broader not teaching of history at all. That is the big problem. Once upon a time when you and I were younger and going to school, we probably had history every year. Today in Massachusetts, it's the 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade. I had a couple of students who were doing a History Day project come to talk to me. They were 8th graders, and they're doing a History Day project on the American Revolution. And they said, our teacher really wants us to do a good job on this because it's the last time we're ever going to learn it. Think about that. You're in the 8th grade. Last time you're going to learn about the American Revolution. And we've also mandated the teaching, for good reason, of civics, world history, and so on. All good things. In the Philadelphia schools, actually, they don't have an American history required course, but there's an African American history required course. Any kind of history you're teaching is going to be beneficial. But I think one thing we've stopped doing is teaching what it is to be an American. what the revolution was all about. Or we have simply given a glib thing. Well, slaveholders did this, they're breaking into the good guys, bad guys. And in this telling, our generation are always the good guys because we know better. Well, it's not always the case. One thing history teaches you is everyone in history thought they were the good guys and they knew better than everyone else. And then history has an inevitable way of proving us wrong. So I see what you're mentioning as a reaction to something else, which is stopping to teach history at all. And then the history we'll be teaching is not really a recognizable one, but simply let's identify who the good guys, bad guys were, or how these align with whatever our values are. And I'm not quite sure we know what our values are. And I think we would probably be quite shocked to think of what they are. So yeah, I understand this. And I understand the ideas on each side about the nature of this. But I think one thing we should see is each side, everyone recognizes how important it is to teach history at all. And if you're only going to be having essentially 3 years of American history or 3 years of history at all, well, what kind of a history do you want? And it's not simply, do we want to make these kids feel bad or these kids feel good? But understand something else. I mean, with teaching history, we're kind of doing two things here. One, we are talking about how people responded to different challenges and what was their world like and how did they try to reshape it if they could, how did they respond to it, what comes out of it. That's kind of what my understanding of history is. And then there's the other thing, what do we want people to know when they become citizens? I mean, that's been one of the real impetuses to teaching American history, is because we want people to be informed citizens. And it's not going to be they'll take a test at the end of the year or take the MCAS in 10th grade, but it's something they will be being tested on over the next generation and a half as they're raising their children. So it's a very serious question. And I don't think we should reduce it to that side wants to teach bad stuff, our side wants to teach good stuff, but thinking about what's being taught at all. That's really, to me, one of the great crises of our time is how we're teaching this.
Yeah. That's a much more fundamental question, which requires a much more complex answer, because, without history, to me, it seems as though we're adrift. And it certainly will exacerbate people's difficulty. If you don't know what it means to be an American and how our history connects with that, then you're going to have a very hard time, perhaps, finding your fundamental identity as an American and enabling that to provide the greater context of whatever either political party means to you. It will be more like sports teams, rather than something that is much deeper and much more precious and much more humanizing. And it affords more opportunity for us to be better people and to form a more perfect union.
Yes.
So thank you for that. That was really interesting. And it adds a missing part of what's been happening, I guess, for a while. I mean, to me, it just seems as though there's enough history in the world. We should be studying it, all of us, every year.
That's right. There's always more of it too. Yes.
Well, Professor Allison, this has been really fascinating. I have one more question I want to ask you, and it has to do with the story that has become well known, the one you just told about Benjamin Franklin coming out of the Constitutional Convention and his response to the question about what kind of government have you given us, a republic if you can keep it. And so I'd be curious to ask you, because people are often talking about, America is or has been pretty broken in a lot of ways, especially since the January 6th insurrection and things that have happened before and subsequent to that. So what do you think Franklin would say if he were around now to see what's happening? Would he go, oh yeah, you guys, I never thought you'd make it. I never thought you'd be able to keep it. Or would he be going, you can do it. You've kept it going this far, get down to work. You citizens take control of your political parties, make sure history is taught. So what do you think Franklin would say if he were around today about whether we've kept our republic and whether we will keep it?
That's an excellent question, and something that requires a great deal of thought, as well as a great deal of hubris to say, I know what Franklin would say.
Well, I know you've studied and written about him.
Yeah. Well, Franklin had a very keen understanding of human nature. I don't think things would have surprised him. And he was always thinking. And Franklin, like Madison, like Washington, like Frederick Douglass, like other characters we study, one reason we study them is they understood human nature. They weren't thinking about making an ideal world because they recognized the materials we have to work with. And so I suspect that Franklin would have not been as surprised as we might think. He would have definitely been pleased to see that now we're using electricity basically to do this, to communicate with each other and with your wider audience. And something he was always hoping for. He was kind of disappointed that the only real benefit he got from electricity was lightning rods, and he figured out how to roast a turkey using electricity. It was a parlor trick. He thought it could be something more. But the other thing, the creation of a government, they recognized, human frailty and the tendency toward dictatorship and other problems. That is, it was their study of history as well as their experience in a political world that they understood that this wasn't one member of the Constitutional Convention said that experience must be our guide. Reason may mislead us. And so they understood the workings of human nature better, I think, than we do or than we want to. And so I suspect Franklin would have, now I'm thinking about the kinds of satires Franklin would have written about our day, which, so very good question. And by the way, just to correct one small thing, we like to tell the story about this woman saying but actually Elizabeth Willing Powell was the woman, and she was someone who knew Franklin very well. And later on, 30 years after the convention and after Franklin's death, someone said, "Oh, I heard you said this to Dr. Franklin as he was leaving the convention." And she said, "Well, what would I have been doing standing on the street?" If I said that, she said she couldn't remember this conversation, but she said it would have happened. It would have happened either at his house or at my house. And we say it's at the end of the convention. By the way, this is a long, rambling, irrelevant detail, but
no, it's fascinating.
James McHenry, who was a delegate from Maryland, kept notes of the convention. And he put this at the very end of his notes. It's something he remembered having come up during the course of the summer. And he couldn't figure out where else to put this, but he wanted to jot it down. And consequently, we historians have taken that to say, the end of the convention. And so it's, we're always learning new things about history and putting in the context of what Franklin and Mrs. Powell were doing, and we're having dinner with each other. Anyway, I could go on for the next hour about Benjamin Franklin, but I know you have a life to get back to, and your listeners do as well.
I'm sure you do as well. But Professor Allison, I can't thank you enough. It's been inspirational and so much fun to talk to you. I really appreciate it. I hope we can get you come back to the morning show because there's more to talk about.
Great.
So thank you. And thank you, everybody, for watching this morning. I hope you'll join us next Thursday at 9 on Channel 9 for the morning show. If you missed any part of today's show, it will be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. Just go to the playlist and scroll down. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8, and then again the following Tuesday at 4 and Wednesday at 3, and will be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud at ncmhub.org. Just click on the cloud icon in the upper right-hand corner. That's it for today. Thank you, Professor Allison.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much.
you, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.